Morning, everybody. My name is Sekar. I'm with Deloitte's Government and Public Sector Practice, the consulting practice based out of Washington, D.C. And I focus mostly on energy transactions in developing countries, most of which are undergoing dramatic states of power sector reform. I'm going to talk today what might first seem like a departure from what we've heard from my colleagues on the panel, which is corporate power purchase agreements. But if we think about it in terms of what Mr. Chavda just talked about load-serving entities and the predictability of load, part of which some of the other presenters talked about in terms of battery storage and how you manage load, this becomes a real risk in terms of that predictability. So corporate power purchase agreements or direct power purchase agreements, the notion is just simply that you're giving the ability of a commercial or industrial enterprise to independently source its own power. And that's not a very complicated notion. And in fact, here in India, there's an open access policy that allows those folks that have, or those entities that have equity stakes in power projects or independent agreements with power projects to do that purchasing. I'm going to refer to those type of structures throughout this discussion as DPPAs. So just consider that an umbrella term for everything that we're going to talk about today. And what I'd like to do is ground this entire discussion in the case study of Vietnam. We have a team of folks working for our client, USAID, on the ground in Hanoi, working with public sector stakeholders to find out what policies are necessary to develop a pilot around a DPPA. And I want to shout them out today, just given the fact that they're not able to make it. Their names are John Wells, Gary Zeef, Grayson Hefner, and Colby Prim. So if anybody has any questions as to the current state of what's going on, I'll refer you to them and just come and see me after our discussions today. So as I was mentioning, this pilot project that we're trying to launch or assist the government in launching is existing in the context of a broader program referred to as the Vietnam Low Emissions Energy Project. There are a number of different work streams, but based on the high profile quality of this DPPA effort and the nature of engaging the private sector to make it happen, it's sort of become the emphasis of the entire project. Now, I was able to help at the outset of it to help make some crucial decisions, but really the hard work is being done now, where implementation is taking place and the pilot is being launched. So the key part to start the launching of a pilot around DPPAs is a giant persuasion campaign. You are asking a country that is going through many power sector reforms to say, also pay attention to what the private sector might want to see while you're making these power sector reforms. And just as a for instance, what the Vietnamese government is doing right now is launching a wholesale electricity market, which is no small feat, right? They're trying to have dynamic pricing, get rid of PPAs. It's a huge endeavor. To ask that at the same time develop a pilot such that two private entities can contract for power with each other and allow the load-serving entities or distribution companies to figure out how to do balancing power for any surplus or deficit of renewable energy products produced or power produced is a difficult ask. But our pitch to them is that allowing for this possibility to happen is saying we are open for business for renewable energy, A, and allows Vietnam to achieve its renewable energy goals, B, right? So why is it so serious? So around 178 companies have signed up for renewable energy pledges, among them being the RE100 Pact that says these companies will achieve 100% renewable energy by 2050, or shorter than that. And of those companies, 38 have a footprint in Vietnam, and it's growing. And just considering the growth rate for the country, that's going to be a demand and an investment that is going to grow for the next several years. And also I would consider sort of what that does for power pricing in the meantime. with a greater amount of investment and a greater footprint for Fortune 500 companies comes a greater demand for electricity. And then on the ground in Hanoi and broader Vietnam, there's a clamoring from the business class for this exact type of structure. So whether that's the American Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce, or the Vietnamese Business Forum, they are actively engaged right now with the public sector to try to make this happen. So part of this persuasion campaign is not just, here is the abstract, what's in it for Vietnam. It's also saying, look, real companies spanning sort of information technology to communications to Alcoa, natural resources and mining, are demanding the ability to source power on their own, right? So Facebook has over 1 gigawatt of power procured under direct power purchase agreements. Same thing with AT&T, roughly 1 gigawatt. And the list goes on and on. And the growth worldwide is impossible to ignore, right? From the early 2010s to just last year, the annual installed capacity procured through DPPAs has seen more than a multiple of 25 growth, right? And whereas you can see on the left chart, most of this is being driven by the Americas, part of where the growth is happening right now, which is encouraging, is not just the United States and Canada. It's happening in places like Sweden and Australia more and more, and then also Chile and India, as you can see with your open access policy. So what exactly is in it for each of these stakeholders? From a power consumer standpoint, it's hard to say that the service of electricity is going to improve in a developing country. What's in it for them, though, is the ability to lock in a long-term price. Locking in a long-term price in a place like Vietnam, which is expected to see a multiple of 14 in growth of the electricity prices, is huge. They just look for stability in terms of that pricing and look to withstand the growth in Vietnam and the corresponding growth in power prices. Power sellers as well, right? So one of the biggest obstacles as a developer for doing work in the developing world is that your primary off-taker is a state-owned enterprise who has creditworthiness issues as perceived in the capital markets. So when going out to the capital markets to develop a wind turbine or a wind farm or a solar array, the rates or cost of capital for a loan or private equity are astronomical, or at least unworkable for the finances. Also, there come onerous terms around sovereign guarantees or other types of guarantees that these developers are unable to get. And for the government of Vietnam, what I was suggesting earlier remains true. Vietnam has sincere goals around achieving more renewable energy uptake. B, sees a growth industry around solar energy. And C, wants to drive foreign direct investment even further, like strike while the iron's hot type of philosophy. So there is a win-win-win sort of scenario among all power sector, or all stakeholders in the sector. Given making that persuasive effort happen, and provided that it continues to be true, really where the sort of rubber hits the road or where the details become important is structuring what this pilot program looks like by going out and surveying internationally what type of deal structures are being done day in and day out. And in doing that and explaining it to public sector stakeholders in Vietnam, we have to really simplify things into 3 or really 2 types of deal structures. One of those is a physical PPA, and the other is a financial PPA. And I'll leave the financial PPA there for a second. Our objective here at this juncture is to convince the public sector stakeholders there's a type of structure to use as a template by which you can make some changes to the parameters, but ultimately tailor it to be how Vietnam does DPPAs. So physical PPAs are fairly intuitive, specifically if you consider the private wire variation of it. The private wire variation of it is as simple as it sounds. If I, as a consumer, engage with a developer, and part of that development philosophy is that we are going to have a direct wire from the solar array to my factory, that allows me to intuitively say, I'm going to set the terms of power delivery and the price of power delivery with that specific developer or generation company. Of course, there's considerations to be had around load management from the power company or the utility, and balancing power to be delivered, and the prices to be sort of tagged onto each one of those. But for now, that's sort of the simplest scenario. But really where we're going and why we ruled out the private wire model is that there are limitations around where exactly that power source can go, particularly if you're considering your investment in the interconnection. So what we wanted to talk about in terms of a physical PPA was a sleeved PPA, just a quote-unquote sleeved PPA, with the idea that a developer can really produce a wind farm or a solar array anywhere on the grid and be able to use the transmission and distribution network to deliver that power to the ultimate end user, with a three-party agreement saying that first, if I'm the consumer, here's the price that I'm going to pay for the producer, and separately, I'm going to pay a postage stamp for the use of the transmission and distribution network. And within that postage stamp falls any number of fees, including access fees or demand-related charges or use charges or wheeling fees. And then even here in India, there's the notion of sort of a cross-subsidy fee that's added into it. So all of those considerations get taken into that postage stamp. And that's what we as a team really thought was the best fit for Vietnam, because sort of what prevents the investment from happening in Vietnam is problematic issues within the sector itself or how the sector operates. This would allow clear agreements, clear numbers to be applied, and clear commitments on a per project basis that would incentivize more investment. The other side is the financial PPA, the synthetic PPA, or however you'd like to refer to it. The issue here is that it's not quite a PPA. It's sort of a contract for differences that lays on the side of the general operations of how the sector works in Vietnam currently. Right? So with the contract for differences, it operates just like any other hedging instrument. So long as both parties are exposed to a spot market, or there's volatility in that market, and it abides by sort of supply and demand laws, both parties can set a strike price at arm's length and say, if I, as the consumer, find the spot price to go over the price that we set, then I get remunerated, or I get income from the generation company. And the generation company says if the spot price goes below the price that we agreed upon, then the buyer makes me whole. The problem with this in Vietnam, and it was very attractive to the stakeholders there, because they had to make limited operational changes, if at all. Most of the effort goes on the side of the private sector. The issue is neither, and I'm happy to answer questions about this later, but neither the buyer nor the seller was exposed to a true supply and demand driven market. There was no volatility there, so there was no incentive really for a contract for differences to be struck. All prices are fixed. So we came at an impasse, but ultimately we were able to, and our team really was able, on the ground right now, was able to come up with a hybrid model that allowed for a synthetic model to occur. I could go over these, but sort of covered these already, right? The economic and financial impacts, market considerations, operational considerations. This is what went into selecting the model. And while this is sort of an eye chart, really what I want to point out is along the right side is where we were able to make a breakthrough. It's allowing large consumers access to a spot market. As I mentioned, Vietnam right now is developing a wholesale market that is governed by supply and demand. That means all developers or all generation companies are going to be exposed to a volatile spot market. What we were able to at least have the public stakeholders tentatively agree to was that they would allow certain large consumers to be exposed to the same market, except slightly augmented with a DPPA charge on it. And we'll get to that specifically, but basically what that means is on time of use, what the developer or generation company is being compensated for is at any point where the time of day pricing is below the strike price within a certain finite amount of time. You may ask why any buyer would want to set the price so much higher than what the average spot price is. The idea would be over time that tariff prices would exponentially raise, and setting this price now is of benefit to them. Similarly, this is what the price is being charged now to the consumer would be under the new DPPA model, meaning they would no longer be charged the bold squiggly line of set retail pricing. They would instead be exposed to wholesale electricity charges. And therefore, you would have a benefit on both sides to strike a contract for differences. So quickly wrapping up, what exactly did all of this process entail? First, it entailed sort of doing a survey of the global market for DPPAs, and then developing a fairly robust financial model that showed in multiple scenarios what a win-win-win situation looks like for all the three major players. Then looking at risk identification, and that brings us to where we are right now, which is creating a rough term sheet, developing what the must-haves for all parties included are, and then prepping for an actual pilot to happen either later this year or early in 2020. We can go through these term sheet must-haves, but I'll direct you to the left side of this screen, which means basically these must-haves in the term sheet and all of the structures revolve generally around operationally, how can we work with the utilities, data tracking, is the metering system going to give us correct information on a real-time basis, transactional, which means that the government isn't interjecting too much into an arm's length deal to be struck by a consumer and a seller. And then protection. Should the market fail, is there insurance or is there assurance from the public sector or public sector stakeholders that the two parties will be made whole? So this is just sort of a rundown of the agreements that we're currently in the process of making. Including what the CFD agreement looks like, what the access for a consumer to the wholesale market looks like, what an interconnection agreement looks like, et cetera. And what I would ask is that given the wealth of knowledge in India for establishing an open access program is, if anybody really has concrete ideas about what this might look like or have suggestions, we're open ears, because right now we're operating in a pretty wide open space, and it's pretty exciting, and we're thankful to have sort of a very, very helpful counterparty partner at this moment. So thank you.